Hey guys, we're here for Chapter 8, Encyclopedia Brown. This one's called The Case of the Knife in the Watermelon. Mr. Patch was the first grown-up to come to the Brown Detective Agency. He was carrying a watermelon. Mr. Patch owned a grocery store. He showed the watermelon to Encyclopedia. It had a knife buried up to its handle. "Find the boy who owns this knife," roared Mr. Patch. "Look what he did." Encyclopedia looked at the watermelon. "Stabbing a watermelon isn't against the law," he pointed out. "I mean, it's not the same as stabbing a person." "The knife ended in my watermelon," Mr. Patch shouted. "It started in the window of my storeroom." "Someone used the knife to break into your storeroom and to open my money box," cried Mr. Patch. "How much was stolen?" asked Encyclopedia. "The thief didn't have time to take anything," said Mr. Patch in a calmer voice. "He heard me coming and got scared. Then he started to run and he tripped and fell. His knife plunged into the watermelon, but he didn't have time to pull it out." "Did you see his face?" Mr. Patch shook his head. "No, but I did see the letter L on the back of his jacket." "That means he's a lion, member of the Boys Club on Woodburn Avenue," said Encyclopedia. A real lead. The private detective stepped closely to the watermelon. The knife had plunged into it so deeply that only the carved wood handle showed above the green skin. Mr. Patch laid a quarter on the gasoline can. "Find the owner of this knife, quick." "I'm sorry," replied Encyclopedia, thinking he would have to charge for expenses on this case. "I'll need a little time. I'll have to buy a fingerprint kit. Then I'll have to dust the handle of the knife, and there are no fingerprints," said Mr. Patch heavily. "I wiped them off." "You wiped them off?" asked Encyclopedia weakly. Mr. Patch explained. "My cat knocked over a bag of flour on the shelf. It broke and spilled over the watermelon and knife. I wiped off the flour." "And the fingerprints too?" Encyclopedia clasped his head and moaned. Then he looked up. "Still, the thief doesn't know that you wiped his fingerprints off." Encyclopedia took out his handkerchief and then wrapped it carefully around the handle of the knife. "That does it," he said. "That makes it look as though we have fingerprints we are trying to save. The thief may try to wipe them off and give himself away. We'll have to watch all the lions. Let's go." Encyclopedia got into Mr. Patch's truck. They drove to Woodburn Avenue. 4 lions, John, Frank, Corky, and Buster, were outside the club, working on the engine of an old black car. Although few in number, the lions were all big boys, meaner than Bugs Meany. But Mr. Patch was bigger than any of them. He had strong hands and big arms. So the lions listened to when Encyclopedia spoke. "Do you see this watermelon?" he asked. Now I take off the handkerchief. There, what do you see?" "The handle," said Buster. "Of a knife?" said Corky. "Very interesting," said John. "So what?" said Frank. "The knife," said Encyclopedia, "was used in an attempt to rob Mr. Patch's store." "The knife," said Buster, "doesn't belong," said Corky. "To any," said John. "Of us," said Frank. "Maybe not, but the police will probably take your fingerprints," said Encyclopedia. "And if the guilty boy steps forward now, Mr. Patch will ask the police not to be too hard on him." The lions looked serious. Mr. Patch looked serious. The only boy detective in the state looked serious. But that was all. "It's not working the way you planned," said Mr. Patch in a whisper. "None of them have tried to wipe the handle of the knife." Mr. Encyclopedia nodded. "Leave the knife in the watermelon just as it is. Don't touch it," he whispered back. To the lions, he said, "The police will break up your club if they find one of you is a thief." The lions stopped looking serious. They looked scared. Suddenly, John said softly, "Frank owns a knife like that." "A lot of fellows own knives with carved handles," retorted Frank. "Cut it out." "You showed me yours yesterday," John shot back. "You even tried to get me to hold it. Why My fingerprints might be on that handle. It's not the same knife, said Frank, so quit worrying. I lost my knife last month, Buster said. Everyone knows I did. Where's your knife, Corky? I lost mine too. This one couldn't be my knife anyway. Mine has a blade that's a half an inch longer. None of the lions remembered what the other knives really looked like. They began to argue loudly. Each boy tried to put himself in the clear. Too bad, muttered Mr. Patch. They are scared and fighting amongst themselves. But none of them has touched the knife to try to get rid of the fingerprints. Your plan didn't work. Oh, yes, it did, said Encyclopedia. I know whose knife it is. How did he know whose knife it was? You get to figure it out.